All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Alan, and it's that time yet again. Let's talk metal. So today, I thought I would talk about some British heavy metal, but not new wave of British heavy metal. I talk about that a lot on this channel. I'm really interested in that area and love a lot of that music. But today, I want to talk about what came after the new wave of British heavy metal and kind of look at those mid and late 80s years when the new wave of British heavy metal was wrapping up and, no longer a thing. Something that made me think of this topic is that the subject of late 80s British metal comes up from time to time on other channels and in some of the live streams that I do with Marty over on the Heavy Metallurgy live stream he and I do. You can see that on the Marty Worm channel, of course. We try to do it once a week. And yeah, from time to time, a question that always comes up is, what were like the British bands doing in terms of thrash, and why aren't there more British thrash bands? And some people will throw out names and be like, well, there's this band and that band, and other people will be like, yeah, but there's not very many, or maybe they're not as good. So I've been thinking about that more and figured, yeah, let's dive into that a little bit and explore what was really happening in uh, the UK as we got into those transitional years after the new wave of British heavy metal had done its thing. So, for starters, now again, I'm uh, doing this in sort of a different presentation format because I don't own a lot of these albums. Some I have, some I don't. And it was just going to be a lot easier to be able to show all the albums I wanted to discuss rather than holding up 50% of them and not the other half. So yeah, we'll just do it this way. And we'll start with the new wave of British heavy metal and then kind of work our way through the end of it and up towards 1990. So most people would define new wave of British heavy metal as lasting from about 1979 to 1984. And some people would have a much more narrow time range than that. A lot of people would list maybe like 80 to 82 are really the only, good years. I tend to be a little more inclusive and give it a little wider timeline. You definitely have new wave of British heavy metal releases coming out in 1979, even if there aren't a ton of them. And up through 1984, it's hard to argue that there's not still quality, solid new wave of British heavy metal being put out there. When you get to 1985, same things occurring, although maybe there's a little bit less of it overall. You still have some good albums. For example, Titan's Rough Justice came out in 85. You still have some excellent 7-inch releases by bands like Virtue and Elixir. So even into 85, you're seeing that there's a strong new wave of British heavy metal presence. Um, Maybe it's petering out some. Maybe some of those bands have already hung it up or disappearing or switched to a more commercial sound by this point. But you can kind of stretch new wave of British heavy metal into 85 if you want to. I don't think it's too much of a stretch of the imagination. It is worth thinking, though, what else is happening in the UK in 85. Um, there's been, of course, a heavier metal presence ever since, Venom came onto the scene. In 85, Venom releases their fourth album, Possessed. And most folks would agree that Venom is past their prime by this point. This album was widely considered pretty disappointing. Even today, it does not seem to be one that has people have grown fonder of with time, or that it's gained a cult following. Not so much. With Venom, it's especially about those first two albums, and the third album, At War with Satan, can fit in there too. But by the time number 4 came out in 85, Venom seems to have run their course. Not a whole lot on that album that people gravitate towards anymore. Instead, you have a new player in town that's kind of taken over the really heavier end of the metal spectrum, and that's Onslaught with their Power from Hell album. Now, Onslaught's an interesting band because they went through a lot of changes during their existence. Prior to this, they had been more of a hardcore affiliated act. So yeah, if you go back to some of their earlier demos and stuff, it was more in the hardcore vein, but they got more into sort of the Venom Motorheadish side of metal by the time they put out their first album here in 1985. So, there are signals of heavier things to come, maybe not a whole lot of them just yet. Something that's important to point out, and this is a good time to do so, is that bands were active well before they released their first album. So, there were definitely other heavy projects that were up and running in 1985, doing demos, playing live shows and such. The albums are just kind of a convenient way of seeing exactly when that band started to be exposed to a much wider audience because they had, a commercially available product out on shelves for people to buy. You didn't have to just know about the band or catch them in a pub or something. You could actually go to the record store and be like, oh, hey, there's this band and they've got a new album out. So I'm using the albums as benchmarks for time, but yes, always keep in mind that bands were always active before the first album was released. Onslaught didn't magically appear out of thin air in 1985. That's just when they got their first album out. All right, let's switch to 1986. 86 is an interesting year for British metal. First off, in terms of what some of the bigger named acts were doing, the big four of British metal are shown here. And they were all doing kind of weird things in 86. Iron Maiden released Somewhere in Time. It's an album some people like and some people don't. If nothing else, it's very different than everything they've done before this album. This was a band that just 2 or 3 albums before made a point of printing on, the album's liner notes that absolutely no keyboards were used in the recording of this album, referring to, peace of mind. And here you are a few years later, and you've got an album that's absolutely drenched in keyboards and synths and all that kind of stuff. So Iron Maiden's going in a very different direction now than what they had in the past. Same can be said for Judas Priest, although they're going into a very sort of almost party metal music mode. The true British steel of the past few albums is getting replaced by a more digestible sound, something that's more MTV friendly, meant to have more radio hits for folks to just kind of party on to. I like Turbo. It's kind of a fun album, but yeah, it's definitely not maintaining the same kind of true metal steel that Defenders of the Faith or Screaming for Vengeance had. It's a different beast. Speaking of different beasts, Motorhead comes out with their first album in about 3 years with Orgasmatron. And this is I believe their first one after they've left Bronze Records, if I remember right. And Orgasmatron's a weird sounding record. It's actually the first Motorhead record I ever heard. It's not a bad record at all. It's got a lot of cool songs on it. I love Death Forever, Orgasmatron, of course. But it's got a really weird sound to it. It's got, this, again, very electronic, very sort of dry, almost computerized, processed sound to it. Very different from what they've done before. And as for Black Sabbath, well, they release an album, if in name only. Tony Iommi is doing the 80s hard rock thing with guys like Glenn Hughes at this point. It's, again, should have been released under Tony Iommi's name, not the Black Sabbath moniker. The reason I'm mentioning what these bigger bands is doing is that I think it shows that the stage was set for bands to be doing very different things at this point, that the state of British metal was entering a time of flux. And you kind of see that because this is also the last year where there's any real push to say there's a strong new wave of British heavy metal presence. 86, I think, is definitely the last hurrah for the new wave of British heavy metal. This is a lot later than some people would set as an endpoint for that movement, but you do have a lot of quality releases that come out that year by bands that were clearly affiliated with the new wave of British heavy metal. So personally, I'm okay inching it up to 86. Let's look at some examples. Desolation Angels gets their first album out. This is a band that, again, had been around for a while. They'd released a very good single in 1984. They just didn't get the first album out for a couple of years after that, and it's an excellent album. Angel Witch comes out with Frontal Assault in 86. They're bouncing back from the very poorly received Screamin' in Bleeding album. And Frontal Assault got a better reception, but it was a little too late to do the band much good. This is 6 years after the self-titled album came out. It's also about 15 different lineups later. They'd gone through a ton of personnel by this point. Even though it's a pretty good album, it was just too late to really resuscitate the band's career in a serious way. But it's not a bad album. It's got some cool tracks on it. Very similar story with Bitches Sins Invaders album that came out in 86. Solid album, a lot of good tunes on it. But the band had, lineup instability issues over the years. And, this was a really nice comeback after the very disappointing Predator album in 1982. But again, the fact that it took them 4 years to make that comeback album means that the boat's kind of already sailed at this point. And even though it's a good album, it's just a little too late for folks to still care very much about Bitches Sin. They're in that same little, they're standing at the dock with Angel Witch, hoping they could get back on the boat, and it just didn't quite work. Cloven Hoof's a little different story. Their second album comes out at this point, and again, they've had lineup changes since their first album was released a couple of years earlier. But Cloven Hoof is also going for a little bit more of a traditional and kind of early power metal structure on this faux live album that they did. It's a nice album, got a lot of very strong songs on it, but it doesn't have a typical new wave of British heavy metal sound at all, which once again, it kind of shows bands are migrating in different directions at this point. But wait, there's more. Some other bands are also kind of getting in their last, big release for the new wave of British heavy metal. Persian Risk finally puts out a full album. This is a band that had been around for years. They did some excellent 7 inches and EPs and such. They finally get Rise Up released, and it's a decent album. It is trending towards the lighter side of heavy metal, though. It also wins the award for largest barbell to ever appear on the cover of a heavy metal album. That's right. I'm just going to give them the title right now. Elixir gets a pretty good album out, but Elixir is very late to the game in new wave of British heavy metal, so it's hard for them to get much attention. Easy Meat was never a huge name act. They get their second album out, Rock Your Brains. Great album cover, but yeah, it doesn't get a lot of attention. You have War Machine releases their first and only album, Unknown Soldier, on Neat Records. And this is another one that has a little different sound to it. Part of that is they have an excellent female vocalist in Bernadette Mooney. The music's got sort of a very haunting vibe to it at times, but it's another one that's kind of shifting more and more towards what you might call early power metal sounds, rather than strict new wave of British heavy metal the way it sounded, 2 or 3 years before this. So yeah, I think there's enough new wave of British heavy metal stuff coming out this year to still say, all right, we've got a new wave of British heavy metal presence. But this is really going to about be it. So what else is happening in 86? Well, thrash has exploded in the US by this time. In terms of UK thrash, I didn't come up with a lot while researching this. Going through my collection, going through lists online and stuff, the one big one that came out in 86 was the second Onslaught album, The Force. And it's worth pointing out, this one does not sound much like Power from Hell. As I mentioned before, this band always kind of kept changing. And with this one, they're going for, a pretty forceful, yeah, pun intended, sorry. But yeah, a more aggressive sounding thrash album, getting away from just Venom and Motorhead influences a little bit, maybe trying to sound a little bit more like, the Dark Angels and Slayers of the world. Not so much, the older British heavy metal bands. Other than that, I couldn't find a whole lot of signs of thrash albums being released in the UK. Bands were doing things, sure, but they weren't releasing full albums just yet. So let's get to 87, and let's check back in on the big guys. Where are they? Well, Maiden is somewhere on tour. Judas Priest is, buying turbo-powered vacuum cleaners because they have the word turbo on them. Motorhead comes out with Rock and Roll, which I think is one of their best albums. I really like that one. And while it's a great Motorhead album, it's also their last one for about 4 years after this. There's a long break after this. So, they had these 2 albums in 85, 87, and then, yeah, they're active, of course. They're touring, but they don't put out more albums for a while. They once again kind of slip off the scene. And Black Sabbath is still in a state of flux, lineup changes, so unstable around this time. They get the Eternal Idol album out. Some folks really like this album, others don't. Personally, it's not a favorite of mine. It's a very confusing time, for Black Sabbath. It's so confusing, there's 2 different versions of the album with 2 different singers on it. This is the first one with Tony Martin on vocals, but the album had previously been recorded with Ray Gillen on vocals. I've heard both versions. It's been a while. As I recall, I think I like the Gillen version a lot better than the Martin version. But regardless, in my opinion, it's definitely not the strongest Sabbath material, not even the strongest of the Tony Martin era. So in a way, you get here to 87 and there's a vacuum. Your four big bands are almost absent from the scene. Priest and Maiden aren't putting out new stuff. Black Sabbath's putting out an album that nobody cared about at the time. It's gained a cult following maybe since then, but at the time it made zero impact. So yeah, it was really only Motorhead that got, a solid album out in 87 from the big four. What's happening instead is you see British acts kind of moving to opposite ends of the spectrum. Def Leppard is about to conquer the world with the Hysteria album. I mean, they were already a huge thing following Pyromania, but they'd been off for a few years on hiatus, following the drummer's accident and rehabilitation. But yeah, they come back in 87 and they release an album that truly is just the definition of global domination. It may be a little hard for younger metal fans to get this concept. If you didn't grow up in the 80s when metal was a big thing, or even just like in the 80s or 90s when albums were a big thing. These days, albums come out and they don't take over the charts for weeks or months. Or if they even do, nobody cares. Nobody pays attention to that stuff very much anymore. Hysteria produced something like 6 top 10 hit singles. That's insane for any time period. One of the videos off of this, Pour Some Sugar on Me, was like #1 on the MTV's daily video voter countdown thing for months, not days, not weeks, months. It's inconceivable of something like that happening these days. Things come and go so fast in the current media cycle that, yeah, an album comes out, everybody plays it a few times, gives it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and kind of moves on very quickly. This Hysteria album dominated the music scene in 1987. You could not avoid this album. You couldn't get away from these songs. It was huge. All right, now at the same time, Def Leppard's finding crazy levels of commercial success. You also had Napalm Death at the other end of the spectrum release Scum. And this is an album that also got a lot of attention when it started coming out. It was, Napalm Death was championed by John Peel very early, and it made an impact. They got airplay on national BBC radio. A lot of people got to check this band out. And so, yeah, I think it's kind of telling that you have bands moving lighter and heavier, two extremes here. And what did that leave room for in between? Well, you had a couple of bands showing up on the thrash scene in the UK at this time. Deathwish released their first album, At the Edge of Damnation, which is pretty good. It definitely still has some maybe hardcore punky beats to it a little bit. Not a bad album though at all. And you have Virus releasing their first one, Pray for War, which is similar. I like it. But it's you can tell it's released in a country that has a pretty strong punk and hardcore pedigree to it, because that's definitely pretty strong in these thrash albums. But yeah, other than these, again, I'm not finding a ton of thrash being released in the UK. Right. As far as new wave of British heavy metal goes, yeah, there's not much on the landscape. That party is definitely over. The only two things I think you could even remotely apply the title to would be the 7-inch by Charger, Desperados, which is an amazingly good single. I've talked about it to death on other videos. It's one of my favorite out of the UK. But yeah, it doesn't really have any traditional new wave of British heavy metal sound. It's getting into, again, more of a pseudo modern power metal sound to it. Excellent release, but I don't know if it's fair to call it new wave of British heavy metal. In terms of other bands, Satan is still around. They released the Into the Future EP. This is a long, long way from Court in the Act and the original 7-inch. This is another band that's gone through some lineup changes, and their new sound, I don't know as I'd call this one new wave of British heavy metal either. They're getting maybe some power elements worked in, maybe some thrash elements worked in too. There's only 3 songs on this EP, if I remember right. It's pretty short, but at least shows the band was still knocking around. All right, so yeah, 87, again, there's this kind of weird vacuum there. What does that mean in 88? Well, in 88, two of the big four released albums. You had Maiden put out Seventh Son, which is taking the Somewhere in Time formula and really expanding on it. It's probably their most progressive album. It's one of my favorite albums by them. I really love this one. It's got, this kind of pseudo concept running through it, really excellently done. But, a far cry from the days of The Trooper and Number of the Beast and stuff like that. Yeah, meanwhile, Judas Priest is still kind of in their 80s party mentality with Ram It Down. This is an album that usually is not looked upon fondly by fans. It does have some real good bangers on it. The title track is excellent. Blood Red Skies is a great anthem. But at the same time, it has some songs that are pretty forgettable. And of course, it has the horrible, horrible, horrible Chuck Berry cover of Johnny Be Good. There are some things that are just not a good idea to do on a heavy metal record. That's one of them. So I don't think it's the worst Priest album ever, but it's definitely not Priest at their finest either. So that's what the big guys were doing. But the real action was at the heavier end of the spectrum. Napalm Death had already released one album. They get their next one coming out with From Enslavement to Oblivion, and other more extreme bands are getting their first albums out too. In particular, Bolt Thrower and Carcass show up. You get In Battle There Is No Law, which is a great album. It holds up extremely well after all this time. The early Carcass, of course, had a huge impact on heavy metal moving forward. I didn't get into Carcass until a little bit later, so I don't have as big a connection with this album as many folks do. But yeah, you've got, with releases like this defines what the face of, quote unquote, real heavy metal is going to be like in the UK moving forward. I've got the Paradise Lost banner up there just to point out that, again, other bands were active. They just hadn't gotten to the album release point yet. Paradise Lost was working on demos. So you had, that wave of, death doom giants would come a few years later, but some of them were already working on material at this stage. So yeah, with this kind of really heavy material coming out in 88, it sort of overshadows what was going on with thrash. You do see more thrash releases from British bands in 88. As I started digging around, I started finding more and more. But a lot of these are either not well known or just not that highly regarded. And I do think a big part of the problem is what was going on here in the death and sort of grind end of the spectrum, that these were the things getting the attention. If you were looking for something extreme to listen to, are you going to pick that Carcass album, or are you going to pick that Hydra Vein album when you see it on the shelf? The Hydra Vein is one of those things that often shows up on lists of like top 10 worst heavy metal cover arts of all time. Personally, I don't think it's that bad. It probably might still be in the top 25 worst, but not the top 10. That's being too harsh. But yeah, these thrash bands are getting their albums out finally, but they're kind of late to the party in a way. Virus has their second album out, Force Recon. Death Witch has their second one out with Demon Preacher. Both of these are good albums. They follow in the footsteps of their previous albums. The first Annihilated album comes out that year. And again, some of these have gotten, sort of a fan base over time. But in 1988, they weren't making a big impact. They weren't, racking up the sales. They weren't getting the top reviews or stuff like that. The one exception, the one that's the highly regarded album on this list, and it's no surprise to anybody, is the first Sabbath album, History of a Time to Come. It's a great album. It's, of course, highlighted with Martin Walker's amazing lyrical dexterity. He packs so much information and puns and innuendos and stuff into all of his lyrics. Great album. I do like it. I will say, even it can be a little ponderous to try to sit through all the way from start to finish, just because it's so dense and there's so much stuff packed into it. So yeah, there are UK thrash bands here, but it's almost like the UK has skipped over thrash a little bit. They've gone from new wave of British heavy metal releases in 86 to these kind of extreme metal releases in 88. And Thrash missed that boat. It just didn't have as much room to wiggle in there and make a big impact on the scene locally. What else is happening in 88? There is still a little bit of a traditional metal presence around this time. Satan has another album out here, Suspended Sentence. This one, I could almost put it on the previous page with some of the Thrash releases. Again, this is a far cry from what they were doing back in the Court in the Act days. It's still Satan in name, but new lineup, new sound, and yeah, they're leaning towards that Thrash side of things. Not completely. I don't know whether you'd want to call this a Thrash album or not quite. It's borderline. It's close. You have the Wild Pussy Mechanarchy EP is released. This was a very small release. It did not make a big impact at all, but it's a great release and just shows a band working in a forceful style that owes as much to power and speed metal as it does to thrash metal. They're kind of blending some different styles. It's a great release, badly in need of a reissue so that more folks can appreciate the band. The other one in 88 that's interesting to point out is Clovenhoof. It's still around. They have yet another vocalist at this point, and they released Dominator. And this is an album I'm late to the party on myself, but it's a pretty cool release. Production issues aside, there's some great songs on it. It's a solid album. And this is a band that, is very much doing the sort of early power metal thing. This is an album that would be more at home alongside things like Savage Grace and Liege Lord and Omen, a lot of the American traditional power metal bands, more so than anything happening in the UK at the time. So they're still, kind of carrying the torch for that style of metal, which is cool to see because, as we've seen, the landscape was being dominated by stuff that was much, much heavier at this point. 89. You don't have new releases from any of the big four except Black Sabbath, who put out Headless Cross. This is a good Martin era Black Sabbath album, in my opinion, although even this one, it's not something I take out and play very often. And again, at the time, nobody could have cared less, really. Black Sabbath was very dead in the water as an entity at this point. So in the absence of the big four, others were establishing themselves at the top of the British metal landscape. And again, it's the heavy bands that are really defining the metal scene by then. You got Bolt Thrower and Carcass both get their second albums out. Realms of Chaos makes a huge impact. The tie-in with Games Workshop and using the Warhammer 40K universe as kind of a conceptual basis for the album, and using it as part of the marketing strategy was brilliant. It exposed a lot of people to Bolt Thrower for the first time. I have a lot of friends, that have been heavily into role-playing games and stuff over the years. A lot of them have said that, seeing Realms of Chaos advertised in a magazine like White Dwarf, which is a gaming publication, that was their introduction to extreme metal. That is like, oh wow, this band has made a soundtrack to this Warhammer 40K game that I'm really getting into. So it was kind of the perfect marriage of those things. Carcass, is doing Symphonies of Sickness, moving from strength to strength. This is, definitely, the cream of the crop in British metal in 89. As far as thrash goes, some of the bands that had been present for a while were still chugging along at it. Onslaught released their third and last album for their original run. This is the one that has Steve Grimmett on vocals. Grim Reaper, not really a going concern by this point in the decade. It is not a bad thrash album. It feels, the songs are all a little long on it. A lot of the songs tend to run like that 5 to 7 minute range, and it always feels like they probably didn't need to. So not a bad album. I like it, but it's one that, again, kind of feels like it takes a long time to listen to from start to finish. Sabbath gets their second album out. This is the most highly regarded of the bunch, with Dreamweaver. Again, cool conceptual album. Tons more stuff packed into it by Martin Walkyier. Shame it would be his last with the band, but he was going to be moving on to Skyclad soon after this. And so again, kind of what is almost universally considered the best British thrash band, only got these 2 albums out, and then they're done. Virus comes out with their third one, Lunacy, which reminds me a lot of Violence, Eternal Nightmare, doing kind of a similar delivery, the kind of rapid fire, barked lyrics and vocals at times. Sounds pretty good if you like that style of thrash. There's others that are releasing albums too, but again, like Zentrix has their first album come out, Shattered Existence. Pretty good, driving, forceful thrash, no doubt about it. Slammer releases their first one, The Work of Idle Hands. This one has a strong Testament vibe, in my opinion, to it. Again, sounds pretty decent. Annihilated also gets their second one out here. Something that you may notice, though, that I'm doing is making very direct comparison between some of these British thrash bands with clearly established U.S. thrash bands. It's great that Virus, is doing a good job sounding like Violence, but they're not bringing a whole lot of anything new to the game. Slammer's a nice sort of Testament clone, but Testament's releasing their third album around this point. They're already very established on the thrash scene. And they're also releasing an amazing album right around this time with Practice to What You Preach. The thrash scene is already very crowded. It's hard to make a splash at this point, especially when you're sticking very close to a formula that other bands have already got patented. So, yeah, it's not that these albums are bad in any way. I think they're just, I've used this phrase several times today, but I think they're just a bit late to the party getting out there. The scene's already too crowded. And except for Sabbath, none of these bands are unique enough that they're bringing something new to the release that's really going to capture the attention of thrash fans, especially given that a lot of thrash fans, again, people that are looking for the most extreme stuff are already starting to look beyond thrash. They're turning to bands in the UK like Bolt Thrower and Carcass, and in the US, they're turning to bands like Death. And, thrash is already a little bit on the clock here. It's still going to be okay for a couple more years, but the heavier stuff is taking over. This is not the time to be releasing your first thrash album and have it sound exactly like a thrash album that came out, by other bands 2 years earlier than this. All right, and yes, one more check-in on sort of the holdouts for traditional metal around this time. Cloven Hoof, still hanging in there. They released Sultan's Ransom that year. Some folks cite this one as having a little bit more of a commercial lean to it than Dominator. I'm not sure that's a fair assessment of the album. It's pretty close to the Dominator style. It's probably not as good as Dominator overall, in my opinion, but I think it's close, and I think it's pretty close in style, maybe a little closer than it is given credit for. So kudos to Cloven Hoof. They're going to die on that hill. These albums did not do very well at the time. They, have developed a following since then, but they did stick to their guns and do their own thing, even in a metal landscape that was not paying attention to that style anymore. And just one that didn't technically come out till 90, but I wanted to mention because it's a cool album that does not often get brought up. Slander, Careless Talk Costs Lives. This may be the first time we see sort of a throwback to new wave of British heavy metal. Again, even like the Cloven Hoof albums at this point, they don't sound anything like, the opening Ritual or any of the, early new wave of British heavy material. This Slander album definitely is paying a bit of homage to those bands and albums that were more active, say, around 1982 on the new wave of British heavy metal scene. It's a cool Slander album. Like it quite a bit. It's got a lot of fun songs on it. And, at this point, again, you're kind of at that 10-year anniversary mark. That's kind of the first time you start seeing some retrospectives often done on a scene. This was the year when when Lars was working on the 79 Revisited compilation over on the Metal Blade label to try to help celebrate the 10th anniversary of new wave of British heavy metal. So yeah, even by 90, you were starting to see at least some bands, going back and doing sort of the revival kind of thing. We're going to do the old school new wave of British heavy metal release. All right, do you believe that gets us to the end of my list? Now, I am sure I have missed a ton of things here. So it's time for you to talk metal in the comments down below. What are the major bands that I should have shouted out and I didn't? What are some of the key albums that I've overlooked and didn't work in there? I'm sure there are a ton of them. I was not trying to mention every extreme metal release that was coming out. I just wanted to highlight some of them to show where the movement was going. But yeah, I've probably missed a few of the thrash bands that just aren't on my radar. Leave a comment down below and let me know what other things from the late 80s British metal scene need some attention and need to get recognized as being out there, even if they got overshadowed at the time by other bands that were doing either bigger commercial things like Def Leppard or just doing much more extreme things the way Carcass was. All right, going to wrap it up right there. So until next time, everybody, take care, and as always, keep banging your head.